We're at war. In the past 24 hours, we've probably seen the most recent high-level political assassination in that war. Perhaps not the last, certainly not the first. At stake is the very survival of the nation-state system and every achievement of modern civilization that we cherish. If the enemy has its way, 80% of the human race will be wiped out under the most hideous of circumstances over the next several generations. And to the extent that the human race survives at all, if we lose, it will be a humanity of barely a few 100 million people at most that crawls up out of the rubble, takes a measure of its past follies, and casts off the axiomatic assumptions and policies that led to its near self-destruction. No matter how awesome and frightening the stakes, this is a war that we can win with relative ease, but only if we conduct a mobilization of resources like none that has been seen since President Roosevelt mobilized the nation for war of annihilation against that British tool Adolf Hitler. The greatest challenge that we face is that for the vast majority of Americans, the real enemy remains invisible. Nevertheless, this is a shooting war, and the casualties are mounting at a staggering rate. In the Great Lakes region of Africa, since April 1994, literally millions of people, mostly civilians, have been slaughtered. And many million more have been driven from their homes and villages, either into death camps or into equally certain death in forests where they're roaming around without food, being hunted down like animals and killed. In Ibero-America, decades of low-intensity war waged by narco-terrorist gangs and drug cartel mercenary armies, bankrolled by hundreds of billions of dollars in drug money, has claimed tens of thousands of lives already. Leading resistance fighters against these narco-insurgencies, some of the leading nationalists and patriots of the continent, have paid with their lives in each country, especially Colombia and Mexico. In the United States, there have already been acts of brutal aggression, blind terrorist acts, most notably the World Trade Center and Oklahoma City bombings. The current President of the United States has been the target of at least 17 publicly acknowledged physical attacks or planned assassination attempts. At one point in 1994 and 1995, scarcely a week went by without either a shooting incident or a kamikaze plane crashing into the back lawn of the White House. Yet the enemy, through a billion-dollar propaganda effort, has brainwashed a large number of Americans into believing that the enemy lives in Washington at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and that it's time to dismantle our cherished constitutional republic. We're not talking here about a fictional, futuristic scenario penned by H.G. Wells or Aldous Huxley. This is the world we live in today. And whether or not the majority of your friends and neighbors try to escape into the virtual reality of Hollywood, MTV, the 700 Club, the internet, drugs, or Armageddonism, the real bullets are continuing to fly. The enemy I am referring to has a command center. It's located in London. The enemy has a name, the British Empire. London today is the center of world terrorism. 9 governments have publicly gone on the record demanding that the British government stop its sponsorship and harboring of international terrorism. Yet nothing has been done about it, and you have not read a word about it in the American media. London is the headquarters of the $521 billion a year illegal drug business, which we long ago labeled Dope Incorporated. Despite this, most of your neighbors, and even some of you here in this room, scoff at the idea that the British Empire any longer exists except as a museum piece or a tourist attraction. Some of you who know better bow to pressure from your brainwashed friends and neighbors as the enemy marches on. Well, the good news is that we're going to take the next 2-3 hours today to help you solve at least some of the difficulties that you're having in mobilizing your friends and neighbors to this fight. We're going to examine in some depth the three faces of the British imperial enemy. And then my co-speakers are going to give you an in-depth picture of how that enemy is presently deployed against Africa, against Ibero-America, and against the United States. This is not to say that this enemy has abandoned Asia, is ignoring China. We're simply going to give you three examples that I think in rather graphic detail will make the case very clearly. First, we're going to look at the visible empire, the formal structure of the British monarchy and the British Commonwealth, which today occupies nearly 24% of the world's land area and controls over 29% of the entire world population, over 1.6 billion people. The British Commonwealth, as it's pleased to announce in its own propaganda, is the second largest world government agency today, second only to the United Nations, which it in fact dominates. It is also the fastest growing World Federalist Organization in the world today. Secondly, we're going to delve deeper. We're going to explore the real seat of power, what we will refer to as the invisible empire. The invisible empire subsumes the monarchy and the Commonwealth. It also includes the Club of the Isles, which is the successor agency to the old British East India Company, which today controls the vast majority of the strategic raw material wealth, the financial structures, especially the offshore illegal financial structures, and the food supplies of this planet. Two Club of the Isles corporations alone, Rio Tinto and Anglo-American, as of 1996, owned 48% of the world's diamond supply, 25% of the world's gold supply, 45% of the platinum, 10% of the iron ore, and 12% of the copper reserves. And in the past year, they have been on a buying and stealing binge unprecedented in history. So these figures themselves are now highly understated. The club deploys armies of mercenaries, private death squads, to defend their so-called commercial interests. In some parts of the world, these private bands of modern-day pirates and hired guns outnumber and outgun the armed forces of the nations that they've invaded. In Africa today, the Club of the Isles raw material cartels are moving in a replay of the British East India Company's conquest of India to wipe out whole nation-states off of the map and replace them with commercial administrations secured by private armies made up of so-called retired commandos from Britain, South Africa, Rhodesia, Australia, and sadly in some cases from the United States, recruited from retirees in our own military. The Club of the Isles is made up of 3,000 to 5,000 oligarchs, members of the families, a collection of landed and now predominantly financial oligarchical bloodlines that in some instances trace their lineage back to the serene Republic of Venice and even to the Imperial Roman Empire. They are integral to the visible empire. They form an interlocking directorate of corporations, banks, think tanks, tax-exempt fondi, intelligence services, the entire leadership of the environmental organizations worldwide, and other semi-official and official agencies of the British Crown. This is the power behind the throne. The Queen, with all of her prerogative powers, in effect, serves at the pleasure of the invisible empire, this club apparatus, the financial oligarchy. In recent years, as the House of Windsor degenerated into the world's most notorious dysfunctional family and became the brunt of worldwide soap opera media coverage, some factions of the Club of the Isles contemplated the overthrow of the Merry Windsors. It's not the first time that the financial oligarchy in London has contemplated regicide. For the time being, at least, they've decided not to go in that direction. For the time being, the formal structures of the empire are very much to their choosing, and instead they effected a soap opera shift of a different kind. They dumped the pathetic John Major and replaced him with Tony Blair in order to give the soap opera fans something to really cry about. The third phase of this British Imperium is what we call the empire of the mind. This is the most deceptive and, in a sense, the most powerful weapon in the British arsenal. Most of the so-called real feelings, their underlying axioms and values that most people share today, are shaped by a psychological warfare machine headquartered in London. It's the most powerful and efficient propaganda ministry the world has ever seen. Its mission, first and foremost, to destroy the most fundamental idea of Platonic Christian civilization, that man is in the living image of God. Secondly, to achieve that through the spread of cultural pessimism, through drugs, through the fostering of irrationalist cults, and through terrorism aimed at producing mass shock trauma. While for years we've identified the role of such agencies as the Quattuor Coronati Lodge of British Freemasonry, the Tavistock Institute, the Frankfurt School, in spreading this disease of cultural pessimism and irrationalism, today we're going to focus on a different facet of this ministry of propaganda and brainwashing, the Church of England. We will discover in the concluding presentation of this panel that the Church of England spawned irrationalist movements like British Israelism and Gaiaism are thriving in the heartland of the United States side by side. One, the semi-official pagan religion of the militias, the other, the semi-official pagan religion of the environmental movement. Taken together, these two tentacles of the same British psychological warfare machinery are the wellspring for every form of low-intensity warfare currently unleashed to achieve the destruction of the United States. Without a clear recognition of this problem, there is no agency of the U.S. government that is capable of effectively defending the national security interests of the United States, even on the home front. So, having given you a brief outline of what we're going to be covering over the next several hours, let's take up the first of the three faces of the British Imperium today, the visible empire, the formal structure of the British Crown today. The British Empire has no written constitution. It is an oligarchy, pure and simple, modeled explicitly on the Venetian Doge system. The British monarch is at once the head of the Church of England, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and the head of the Commonwealth. She rules through a series of prerogative powers. She alone has the authority to declare war. She alone appoints all of the military commanders and officers of land, sea, and air. The Queen can dissolve Parliament without cause and can similarly dismiss the Prime Minister on a moment's notice. She appoints all judges and magistrates. She appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury and all of the senior bishops of the Church of England. The Queen can initiate criminal proceedings, and she alone can issue a pardon. The principal instrument for this unchecked concentration of power is the Privy Council, a body of approximately 400 prominent individuals appointed for life by the monarch. The term privy refers to the royal potty, the royal commode, and is a reference to the fact that in earlier periods there were only a very small select number of key advisors who were allowed into the inner sanctums of the monarch. So perhaps we ought to use some sanitary measures and flush the whole thing down the drain. The Privy Council consists of the leading members of the royal family, the Archbishop of Canterbury, other leading members of the Anglican Communion, peers from the House of Lords, the Prime Minister, the Law Lords, all cabinet officers, leaders of the loyal opposition in Parliament, and prominent individuals from the City of London. In other words, the leading representatives of the commercial interests that we've labeled the Club of the Isles. 4 out of 5 members of the House of Lords are hereditary lords. They inherited their positions. So in recent years, with the baby boomer generation coming into power, you've got a phenomenon of many members of the House of Lords coming forward to advocate legalization of drugs, and they themselves are notorious drug addicts. Since the Judicial Committee Act of 1833, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, an even smaller body, again handpicked by the monarch, has functioned as a secret Supreme Court for the entire empire, the ultimate court of appeals. Rulings of this court are not made public, but are submitted in the form of advice to Her Majesty. To this day, most member countries of the British Commonwealth accept voluntarily the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council as their own Supreme Courts of last resort. Now, the Queen today is the sovereign of 16 countries and 21 dependent territories, including the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Many of the smaller nations and dependencies, like the Bahamas, Jamaica, and the Cayman Islands, are notorious as drug money laundering centers. In most of these locations, the Queen rules through a Governor General, whom she appoints, and through a local Privy Council modeled on the Privy Council in London. Since the time of King Henry VIII, the British monarch has also been the self-proclaimed Pontifex Maximus, the head of the Church of England and the entire Anglican Communion, meaning both the high and the low-down churches. The Archbishop of Canterbury, as the Queen's Primer Inter Pares, heads the Anglican Communion, which is made up of over 40 separate churches around the world, principally inside the British Commonwealth. So, just as the 53 members of the British Commonwealth constitute the largest voting bloc inside the United Nations General Assembly, inside the Organization for African Unity, inside the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the Anglican Communion constitutes the largest voting bloc within clerical bodies like the World Council of Churches, which we'll hear a lot more about later this afternoon. By now, it should be dawning on you that the so-called British government is a little bit of a hoax, a fraud, a powerless piece of living theater which follows the order of the Crown or is replaced on a whim. As head of the loyal opposition, for example, the current Prime Minister, Tony Blair, was inducted into the Privy Council in July of 1994, taking an oath of loyalty to the Crown and sharing a backbench with his predecessor, John Major. If you need any further convincing about the irrelevancy of the British government today, I can only suggest that you turn on your TV at midnight on a Sunday, turn to C-SPAN, and watch the weekly appearance of the Prime Minister before the House of Commons. It's a poor imitation of the Gong Show. But our picture of the visible empire is hardly complete. Beyond the 16 countries and 21 dependencies where Queen Elizabeth II is sovereign, we have the British Commonwealth. The British Commonwealth, headed by the British monarch, is today made up of the 16 countries and 21 dependencies where the Queen is sovereign, and an additional 37 countries where Queen Elizabeth II is not the sovereign. The 53 countries of the Commonwealth, as I mentioned earlier, have more than 1.6 billion people, 6 times the population of the United States. The Commonwealth includes such, quote, former British colonies as India, Pakistan, South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, which we've already heard a great deal about today and yesterday, Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, Bangladesh, Brunei, Singapore, and Malaysia. Recently, Mozambique, a former Portuguese colony, has been granted membership in the British Commonwealth. Another former Portuguese colony, Angola, has formally applied and is simply awaiting final word of its membership. Already, the Palestinian Authority has indicated that it will formally apply for membership as soon as it achieves nation-state status, and last week an invitation, in fairness, was extended to Israel. Now, obviously, as Lynn discussed yesterday, a number of the countries that are absolutely pivotal to the implementation of the land bridge, such as India and Pakistan, are members of the British Commonwealth. This is problematic, yet there is still a significant possibility in these countries of breaking free from the influences of the British monarchy through the Commonwealth structure and functioning as a genuine, independent, sovereign nation-state, participating fully in the land bridge. I think this gives you an idea why it is that the complete annihilation of the British Empire is synonymous with our successful implementation of these policies. The Commonwealth organization is administered out of, appropriately, Marlborough House, that's the Churchill family, in London, which is the seat of the Commonwealth Secretariat. It has its own diplomatic corps made up of 400 diplomatic officials, representatives of all of the member nations. The British Commonwealth is a kind of mini United Nations unto itself. In fact, recently, the Commonwealth requested and was granted NGO status with the United Nations. Under the Commonwealth Secretariat, there are 7 permanent councils, corporations, funds, organizations that operate in all of the member countries. These are the Commonwealth Development Corporation, the Commonwealth Fund for Technical Cooperation, the British Council, which, by the way, is the British Empire's equivalent of Project Democracy, but they take their roles a little bit more seriously. They have offices in 400 cities in 100 countries around the world. The Commonwealth Institute, the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization, the Commonwealth Science Council, and the Commonwealth Foundation, which is a funding mechanism that doles out money to more than 200 non-governmental organizations, most of which could be properly described as terrorist gangs. The Commonwealth Secretariat additionally directs 27 other associations that I won't bother to name here. The formal business of the Commonwealth is conducted at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which takes place every 2 years. It takes place later this year in Scotland. Now, if any of you have been unfortunate enough to read any of the documents published by the British Commonwealth, don't be fooled by their liberal use of terms like sovereignty, freedom, equality, and human rights. The idea for the British Commonwealth was not a phenomenon of the 1960s so-called winds of change. It was, in fact, a strategy of the British Empire initiated in 1839 to quell a revolt in Canada where there was a fear of a repeat of what happened in the United States with the American Revolution. It was formalized at the 1926 Imperial Conference, where the dominions, or quote, the independent self-governing colonies, were defined as autonomous communities within the British Empire, united by a common allegiance to the Crown and freely associated as members of the British Commonwealth of Nations, unquote. So from the very outset, the term Commonwealth was a cruel hoax simply referring to a more modern-day expression of the old empire. In 1931, the British Parliament passed the Statute of Westminster, granting Commonwealth status to Australia, Canada, the Irish Free State, now the Irish Republic, Newfoundland, New Zealand, and South Africa. The Irish Free State had the good sense to leave the Commonwealth, and to its credit, it's never looked back. Sudan, Yemen, Iraq, and Egypt are other countries that escaped the British yoke after suffering under colonial rule. Now, to secure continued domination over its vast colonial sphere, and to ensure that the ideas of the American Revolution were never allowed to spread to any other part of the British realm, the monarchy during the 19th century established two agencies, Crown Agents for the colonies and the Corps of Commissionaires. Crown Agents was founded in 1833 as an emanation of the Crown, apparently another reference to the royal commode, to administer the empire. From its founding through to 1996, when it was officially privatized, if you believe that, Crown Agents served as the arms brokers, the quartermasters, the paymasters, the private bankers for all of the British colonies. At a certain point in the 19th century, that numbered over 300 separate entities. They printed the coins, they purchased the weapons, they paid the colonial soldiers, they ran the customs houses, they secured the borders, they ran a worldwide commercial shipping fleet, and managed the private real estate portfolios of the leading figures within the empire. The transition from empire to Commonwealth has had virtually no impact on the functioning of Crown Agents. To this day, as the privatized Crown Agents for Overseas Government and Administration, LTD, they serve as the agents for 150 governments and organizations. They manage the entire customs service and borders of Mozambique. Through a contract with the United Nations, they're in charge of all of the reconstruction procurement for Bosnia. So if anybody has any questions as to why nothing has happened, ask Crown Agents. Through another UN contract, they feed all of the blue-helmeted peacekeepers in Angola and Bosnia. They administer $3 billion worth of projects, maintain a $1 billion asset management portfolio, and frankly, things would have been a lot more prosperous for Crown Agents had they not run into a bit of trouble in the mid-1970s, when their speculation in the London commercial real estate markets blew up one of the first big secondary market bubbles and nearly bankrupted them. Fortunately, as an emanation of the Crown, the Exchequer bailed them out in full, a decade before the S&L bailouts here in the United States. The scandal also proved to be embarrassing in another way because it turned out that one of the business partners of Crown Agents in these various real estate deals and other criminal enterprises was none other than Meyer Lansky. So if anybody has any questions about the relationship between organized crime and the British Crown, this should give a bit of an indication of the answer. Now, in its new private incarnation, Crown Agents is just as filthy as it was during the colonial period. All of the stock in the company is held by the Crown Agents Foundation, which is not surprisingly headed up by a Knight Grand Cross of the British Empire, a high-ranking member of one of the chivalric orders appointed by the Queen. The corporate members of the foundation are from the top echelons of the Privy Council and the Club of the Isles, including representatives of Barclays Bank, Standard & Chartered Bank, Unilever, which is an Anglo-Dutch joint venture, Tate & Lyle, the British Sugar Cartel, and the Royal Commonwealth Society, and Christian Aid, which is the official charity organization representing 40 British and Irish churches. Dennis will have some things to say about that organization later this afternoon. Transparency International, a non-government organization founded by the British royal consort Prince Philip to, quote, combat government corruption, if you can believe that, holds a seat on the board of Crown Agents Foundation and in turn the managing director of Crown Agents, P.F. Berry, is on the advisory board of Transparency International. It's all very incestuous. The other Crown emanation launched during the 19th century was the Corps of Commissionaires, which to this day serves as the central hiring hall and coordinating agency for all, quote, retired British commandos, SAS members, soldiers, police, etc. The Corps was founded in 1859, ostensibly to provide jobs for British soldiers demobilized at the end of the Crimean War. Initially, these former military men were hired as uniformed security guards at all of the prominent institutions of the City of London. But soon, Corps of Commissionaires were set up in Australia, Canada, East Africa, New Zealand, and South Africa to service a very large number of British military personnel who had been relocated to the colonies as guarantors of London's permanent control. Today, the Canadian Corps of Commissionaires maintains a standing force of 13,000 retired military and police officials. In comparison, the entire Canadian Armed Force, which plays a prominent role in every United Nations Blue Helmet peacekeeping mission around the world, only has 20,000 soldiers. So, while other British and South African mercenary outfits like Sandline International, Executive Outcomes, Defense System Limited, and Control Risks misrepresent themselves as purely private sector outfits, drawing upon a pool of retired British SAS commandos, British, South African, Australian, and Canadian regular soldiers. The Corps of Commissionaires makes no such attempt to conceal its rigid formal ties to the British monarchy. A spokesman at Buckingham Palace confirmed that Queen Elizabeth, who is officially listed as the chief patron and the honorary chair of the Corps of Commissionaires for Britain, Canada, and Australia, serves in those capacities as part of her official duties as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. So the idea that any of these companies are private in the sense that people here in the United States think about the, quote, private sector is a complete hoax. The Corps of Commissionaires maintains the central roster of all British former servicemen, which is the labor pool which all of these other companies employ. So Crown Agency and the British Crown are the world's largest mercenary organization. This brings us to the invisible empire, which we've already identified with the Club of the Isles, the modern-day reincarnation of the old British East India Company. The only thing that differentiates the present-day club from the East India Company is the fact that the company, like Crown Agents and Corps of Commissionaires, was a Crown emanation, which was first granted a royal charter, which is to say a monopoly, by Queen Elizabeth I on New Year's Day in the year 1600. But in methodology, and in the body count of the genocide carried out by this apparatus, the current Club of the Isles and the former British East India Company are indistinguishable. Just consider a little bit of the history of the company. During the first 20 years of the East India Company's rule over Bengal in the Indian subcontinent, according to its own official accounts, 10 million Indians died either of starvation or in battle against this British occupation, and the vast majority died of starvation. Though ostensibly a purely commercial venture representing the interests of a joint stock company of nominally private investors, the East India Company had its own army, which was larger, better armed, better paid, and better trained than the British colonial army. Its principal commercial venture at its peak of power was the production of opium, which it imposed on the population of China under force of arms, with the full backing of the Crown. The history of 2 opium wars in the 19th century attests to the intimate relationship between the company and the Crown. And the same exact thing can be said for today's opium war, which is being directed by the Club of the Isles and the British Crown against the United States and every other nation state on the face of the planet. So it is now perfectly appropriate for us to say, yes, indeed, the Queen of England is the world's biggest dope pusher. As you know, previously that was misquoted and misattributed as a slander, but some information has come out since 1982 that really buttresses the case beyond doubt. Not the least of which is the records of the royal apothecary during the period of Queen Victoria, who spent the last 20 years of her reign in psychedelic splendor on opium and cocaine at Balmoral Castle. Now, the company, in the tradition of Venice, was administered by a three-man secret committee, which represented the major financier oligarchy interests of the City of London. During most of the 18th and first half of the 19th century, this was the House of Baring. The British East India Company also established its own college called Haileybury College, whose influence today is as profound and dominant as it was at the peak of the British East India Company in the 19th century. Who were the leading faculty of Haileybury College? Let's start out with Parson Thomas Malthus, the plagiarizer of the Venetian Gian Maria Ortez, who is today the godfather of the genocide lobby, the so-called zero population growth lobby. Adam Smith, whose Wealth of Nations was merely an apologia, a propaganda tract for the unchallenged power of the invisible hand of the British cartels, was also a leading member of the faculty of the East India Company College. Jeremy Bentham, the usurer and pedophile who attempted to reduce all human thought to the animal desire to seek pleasure and avoid pain, was another leading figure of the Haileybury College apparatus. And Bentham, as the chief agent of the chairman of the secret committee of the East India Company at the end of the 18th century, Lord Shelburne, trained another leading East India Company propagandist, James Mill, whose 7-volume History of India was a recipe book for fostering syncretic irrationalist cults in India to control the population. James Mill's son, John Stuart Mill, who was the tutor of the evil Lord Bertrand Russell, followed his father also into prominence at Haileybury College. So step back a second and look at the curriculum in the economics departments, in the sociology departments, in the psychology departments, and in the political science departments of every university here in the United States and in most countries around the world today, and you will find that the curriculum was written by the British East India Company, and to this day it goes unchallenged. Now, were the Club of the Isles to publish its own annual report, which, needless to say, they don't do, they would have identified Prince Philip as the Chief Operations Officer. In 1994, we at EIR took the liberty of publishing the annual report for them. Prince Philip is most well known as the founder and chief propagandist for the death lobby, otherwise known as the World Wildlife Fund or the Worldwide Fund for Nature, and as a prominent advocate of the reduction of the human population by 80% over the next several generations. In an August 1988 interview with the German press agency, Prince Philip betrayed both his occult religious beliefs and his murderous impulses by stating, quote, "In the event that I am reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus in order to contribute something to solve overpopulation." Now, Prince Philip, in league with the former SS officer, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, created the World Wildlife Fund in 1961, which in turn has spawned 2 successive generations of eco-terrorist organizations, from Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and Survival International to such outright death squads as Earth First and the Animal Liberation Front. In the late 1960s, Prince Philip and Prince Bernhard launched the 1001 Club, which represents the closest approximation of a formal membership list of the Club of the Isles. Prior to the WWF, environmentalism, by the way, was purely a gentleman's sport. No sane human being, in other words, would have thought of considering themselves an environmentalist. Typical of the environmental organizations before 1961 and the beginning of the cultural paradigm shift were the London Zoological Society, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the Royal Geographical Society, the Fauna and Flora Preservation Society, which was originally the Society for the Preservation of the Wild Fauna of the Empire, and the Nature Conservancy, which was dominated by people like Sir Julian Huxley and Sir Peter Scott. Still today, a review of the Directorate of the Worldwide Fund for Nature UK, headed by Prince Philip, and the membership in the 1001 Club, reveals a membership list that includes most of the top officials of such inner core Club of the Isles entities as the Bank of England, Barclays Bank, Royal Dutch Shell, National Westminster Bank, Imperial Chemical Industries, Rio Tinto, Anglo-American, De Beers, N.M. Rothschild, and the Hollinger Corporation's media cartel, whose flagship publication is the Sunday and Daily Telegraph. These companies represent actually one single, tightly interlocked board of directors in which people from the board of one company are not only on the board of the WWF, have membership in the 1001 Club, but also are on the boards of 3 or 4 others of these entities. So this is a corporate financial oligarchy. It was this World Wildlife Fund apparatus that the EIR first exposed in 1994 as the architects of the mass genocide in the Great Lakes region of Africa. For all of those newspapers that in the last 6 months have begun publishing front-page photographs and news articles about the genocide, remember that it began years ago. EIR's been reporting on this all along. We discovered that it was the World Wildlife Fund, through its administration of so-called nature preserves and game parks strategically located on the borders of the targeted African states, that employed the former SAS commandos to train and arm and deploy local death squads. Through officially sponsored WWF programs like Operation Lock, SAS men were deployed to assassinate political leaders and foment out-of-control civil war and ethnic cleansing. Africa today is a testing ground for every form of genocide that the British and their oligarchical allies can conceive of. And Africa is slated to be the first continent where the nation-state system dies a sudden and violent death. And on whose behalf is this murderous warfare being conducted? The very British and Anglo-Dutch raw material cartels and financial interests that are at the center of the invisible empire. Now, this brings us to the third face of the British Empire today, what we have called the empire of the mind. Several of the other speakers are going to deal with this issue at greater length, so I'll be brief and focus on just a few vital questions. By now, it should be clear to all of you, indeed, that the British Empire does still exist to this day, and is, if anything, more devoted to evil than at any time in its history, including the time of the American Revolution. Why then are most people today irrational and blind to this fact? Even though their lives and the lives of their most cherished relatives and friends may depend on defeating this British Empire. There's only one answer to that question. Most people have been brainwashed into accepting irrational ideas that would have never been acceptable 30 years ago. The brainwashing process that I'm referring to is subtle. It takes place over time. It takes place on a societal level so that the likelihood of a large-scale resistance is improbable unless well organized. How did it happen here in the United States? Look back at the 1960s. Look at the impact of the assassination of President Kennedy, and particularly the assassination followed by that cruel hoax cover-up called the Warren Commission report. The British were behind the Kennedy assassination, just as they were behind the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, and William McKinley, all four American presidents in the tradition of the American system of political economy, all four enemies of the British oligarchism and free trade. The late New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison was indeed on the trail of the assassins. We spoke with Garrison, we compared notes with him, we shared information, and in fact, we worked with Garrison when he was completing his book about the JFK murder. But for two crucial pieces of evidence that were never presented to the jury, it is virtually certain that Garrison would have obtained a conviction of Clay Shaw for the conspiracy to kill John Kennedy. And that would have opened a Pandora's box. Garrison had traced the origins of the murder plot to Montreal, Canada, to the offices of a man named Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, wartime British Special Operations Executive Officer, liaison to the FBI in the United States, the founder of the Canadian branch of Prince Philip's World Wildlife Fund, a charter member of the 1001 Club, and a high-ranking official of the United Nations, just so he didn't leave that off of his resume. But Garrison was stymied by traitors in Washington like Henry Kissinger's mentor McGeorge Bundy. And this opened the floodgates. The Malcolm X assassination, the Martin Luther King assassination, the urban riots, which destroyed the cities of the United States, the Robert Kennedy assassination. John Kennedy, with the advice of General Douglas MacArthur, was about to pull out the American troops from Vietnam until he was assassinated. And with an assassin's bullet always pointed at the back of his skull, Lyndon Johnson drew us into a deliberate no-win war in Vietnam, which was McGeorge Bundy's war. With these shock traumas, most Americans, especially the young people coming up from high school to college during these periods, changed decisively. We abandoned cultural optimism. And as pessimism replaced optimism, psychedelic drugs replaced scientific study. The Beatles replaced Beethoven. The United States was deliberately put through a cultural paradigm shift, a downward spiral into hell that we have yet to reverse, and which we've begun the process of reversing here this weekend. The point to be emphasized is that this was all premeditated. If you know where to look, you can even find the recipe books on your public library shelves. Take, for example, the London Tavistock Institute's William Sargent. In 1957, Sargent wrote a book which, without any subtlety, he titled The Battle for the Mind, A Physiology of Coercion and Brainwashing. The book was based on his studies of irrationalist cults in Africa, in Ibero-America, in the Deep South in the United States. Sargent set out to discover how whole populations had been transformed from creative human beings, each individually capable of reason and discovery, into irrational beasts. And he wrote about it in this book. He wrote, "Various types of beliefs can be implanted in many people after brain functioning has been sufficiently disturbed by accidentally or deliberately induced fear, anger, or excitement. Of the results caused by such disturbances, the most common one is temporarily impaired judgment and heightened suggestibility. Its various group manifestations are sometimes classed under the heading of herd instinct and appear most spectacularly in wartime, during severe epidemics, and in all similar periods of common danger which increase anxiety and sow individual and mass suggestibility. Now think back at the 1960s from that vantage point. So where do our ever-loving British cousins want to see this process go? Again, we can take them at their own words. This time the words of Aldous Huxley, the brother of Prince Philip's mentor, Sir Julian Huxley. What most people don't realize is that Aldous Huxley spent the last 30 very odd years of his life in Hollywood as a part-time screenwriter and full-time propagandist for the psychedelic revolution. But his objectives were not just peace and love. In 1961, Huxley delivered at the University of California Medical School in San Francisco at a conference sponsored by the State Department's Voice of America, a rather chilling lecture. His message was blunt, and it was delivered on behalf of precisely the British oligarchy that we've been discussing here today. What Huxley said was, quote, "There will be in the next generation or so a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak. Producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods." And this seems to be the final revolution. So we have the British oligarchy, the dedicated enemy of everything embodied in the Council of Florence, in the nation-state system, and the American Revolution. Our British enemy is engaged in endgame maneuvers, while the majority of our troops, sadly, are still sleeping in the barracks. Since the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism, the British oligarchy has concluded that they no longer have to tolerate the existence of the nation-state system whatsoever. This process, as Lynn indicated yesterday, began with the cultural paradigm shift in the mid-1960s, but there was a major escalation beginning in 1989. During much of the 20th century, despite the fact that leading spokesmen for the British Empire, like H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, preached world government and world oligarchism, the leading figures in the Club of the Isles and their fellow travelers in Europe and America realized that they could not yet move to totally dismantle the nation-state system so long as there was a potential for the eruption of wars of annihilation, which would require the marshaling of material resources that the oligarchy is incapable of accomplishing on its own. Even during the Cold War, the Wellesian doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, first spelled out by Wells's protege Leo Szilard, was no guarantee that a superpower conflict was impossible. President Reagan, in adopting Lyndon LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative, overturned MAD and demonstrated that point directly. Now, however, the British are convinced that the nation-state system, at least for the time being, can and must be targeted for extinction. 500 years of unsettled coexistence and warfare between republicanism and oligarchism is now being fought out. The idea that the fall of the Soviet Union meant the possibility of what George Bush fondly referred to as the New World Order was a preposterous hoax. Typically, George Bush had it all wrong. The British oligarchy seized upon the collapse of the Soviet Empire to launch a new world disorder, using low-intensity warfare methods to eradicate the nation system everywhere. That's the bad news. The good news is that we have certain decisive advantages in this showdown if we seize the moment and do the right thing. First of all, It's their system that's crumbling. We are in the onset of the greatest cultural, monetary, and financial collapse in modern history. It is not just the financial bubble that's going to explode. All of the underlying assumptions of their paradigm shift of the past 30 years are collapsing around them. Those ideas violate the laws of the universe, the laws of nature, the laws of man. Second, we as a philosophical association exist worldwide. Lyndon LaRouche has established himself as America's leading patriot and as the world's leading world citizen. LaRouche issued the resistance call when the friends of the British oligarchy installed that wacky Jimmy Carter into the White House in 1977. At that time, LaRouche led the drive to defeat the British Opium War, the legalization of drugs movement in the United States, which to this day is a strategic priority for the Club of the Isles, as evidenced by the recent surfacing of the Queen's personal speculator, George Soros, to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into the effort to revive that dead horse of drug legalization. In the 1977 to 1983 period, LaRouche was the intellectual author, and this political movement was the driving force that got President Reagan to adopt the Strategic Defense Initiative, which changed world history forever. This demonstrated the war-winning capability of our philosophical association worldwide. And it's on the shoulders of those accomplishments today that Lyndon LaRouche is leading the drive to convene the new Bretton Woods Conference, to roll back the New Age, to roll back the post-industrial paradigm, and complete the unfinished work of the Council of Florence and our own American founding fathers. Third, contrary to the fantasies of the British oligarchy, man is not a beast driven by pleasure and pain alone. Man is endowed by his Creator with the capacity for reason, discovery, and truth. The truth can truly set you free, and your mastery of the truth can help free all of mankind from the hell that the British otherwise have in store for all of us. So sit back, put on your thinking caps, be prepared to look inside your own minds, and prepare to organize the minds of your friends and neighbors.